A single gunshot echoed across the vast Wyoming plains as Nora O'Connell fled through the darkness, her heart pounding like a stampede of wild horses against her ribs. She had endured her brother's cruelty for years, but tonight, as they held her down while she screamed for mercy, something inside her had finally shattered like glass beneath a boot heel. The year was 1878, and Medicine Bow, Wyoming territory, was still a rough-hewn settlement carved from wilderness. At 22, Norah had spent her entire life in the shadow of her three brothers who had taken control of the family ranch after their parents' deaths 5 years prior. What had once been subtle resentment from her brothers had grown into something dark and twisted, culminating in their attempt to force her into marriage with the aging, wealthy rancher who coveted their land. Norah ran blindly through the moonlit night, her torn dress catching on sagebrush. The brothers had grown tired of her resistance, and tonight they had decided to break her spirit once and for all. They'd held her down, slapped her when she refused to agree to the marriage, and were about to do worse when she'd managed to break free, grabbing her father's old pistol on her way out. Her legs burned as she pushed forward, uncertain where she was heading but knowing she could never return. The pistol hung heavy in her hand, a single shot fired into the sky as a warning when she'd first escaped. Now she had nothing but 5 bullets and the clothes on her back. Miles away, Mason O'Brien sat by his campfire on a hillside overlooking Medicine Bow. The 28-year-old cowboy had been drifting for 3 years since leaving Texas, taking work where he could find it and avoiding putting down roots. His weathered hat rested beside him as he sipped coffee and considered his options. The cattle drive he'd been working had ended yesterday, and tomorrow he'd need to decide whether to sign on at one of the local ranches or move on. The distant gunshot cut through his thoughts like a knife. Mason listened intently, years of frontier life having taught him to distinguish between the sounds of celebration, hunting, and trouble. This shot carried the distinctive echo of desperation. Setting aside his coffee, Mason stood and scanned the darkness. Most men would mind their own business, but something about that solitary shot called to him. He doused his fire, gathered his gear, and swung onto his horse, a sturdy Palomino named Chance. "What do you say we take a look, boy?" he murmured, patting the horse's neck before urging him down the hillside toward the source of the sound. Norah stumbled across a small creek, the cold water shocking her bare feet as she waded through. She could hear her brothers' voices in the distance, calling her name with promises that things would be different if she returned. Lies, all of them. There would be no mercy if they caught her now. She pressed on, though her strength was fading. The spring night was chilly, and her wet dress clung to her legs. She didn't know how much farther she could go before collapsing from exhaustion. The sound of approaching hoofbeats filled her with renewed terror. Had they mounted their horses already? Ducking behind a large boulder, Norah raised the pistol with trembling hands. She had never shot a man before, but tonight she was prepared to do whatever necessary to remain free. Mason slowed Chance to a walk as they approached the creek. Something had caught his attention: footprints leading into the water, fresh ones. Following his instincts, he crossed the creek and scanned the area carefully. "Hello," he called softly. "I mean no harm." From behind the boulder, Nora's breath caught. The voice wasn't familiar, not one of her brothers. Still, she remained hidden, the pistol ready. "I heard a shot," Mason continued, dismounting but keeping his distance. "If you're in trouble, I can help." Silence stretched between them until finally Norah spoke. "How do I know I can trust you?" Her voice was hoarse from screaming earlier. Mason stayed where he was, making no sudden movements. "You don't. But I give you my word as a man that I intend no harm. I'm just a cowboy passing through." After a moment's hesitation, Nora peered around the boulder. The moonlight revealed a tall man with broad shoulders standing beside a palomino horse. His hands were visible, empty of weapons. "My brothers," she said, the words catching in her throat. "They're after me." Mason nodded slowly. "Then we should keep moving. You can ride with me or on your own, but either way, we need to put distance between you and them." The sound of distant voices made the decision for her. Nora stepped out, still holding the pistol. "I'll ride with you, but I'm keeping this." "Fair enough," Mason replied, respecting her caution. He offered his hand to help her mount, which she took after a moment's hesitation. Once she was settled, he swung up behind her, careful to maintain a respectful distance despite the shared saddle. "I'm Mason O'Brien," he said as they started moving. "Nora O'Connell," she responded, her body tense. "Well, Miss O'Connell, let's find somewhere safe." They rode in silence for nearly an hour, following game trails that wound through the hills. Nora remained vigilant, occasionally looking back over Mason's shoulder, but there was no sign of pursuit. The rhythmic movement of the horse and the warmth of another human being gradually eased some of her panic, though she kept the pistol ready. Mason guided them to a small, hidden canyon, where a natural spring bubbled from rock. "We can rest here until morning," he said as he dismounted and offered his hand to help her down. Nora took it cautiously, wincing as her feet touched the ground. In the moonlight, Mason could see the cuts and bruises that marked her ankles and bare feet. "You're hurt," he observed, his voice neutral. "I'll be fine," she insisted, though she swayed slightly from exhaustion. Mason nodded, not pressing the issue. "I have some supplies, food, water, and a spare blanket. You should eat something." While he tended to his horse, Nora sank down against a rock, the events of the night crashing over her like a wave. She had never been alone like this, never defied her brothers so completely. The reality of her situation, homeless, with nothing but a pistol and the clothes on her back, threatened to overwhelm her. Mason returned with a blanket, a canteen, and some jerky. He offered them to her without comment, then moved to gather wood for a small fire. "Should we risk a fire?" Nora asked, wrapping the blanket around her shoulders. "We're well hidden here," Mason replied, "and you need warmth. Besides, your brothers would be fools to track in the dark." As the flames cast dancing shadows across the canyon walls, Nora studied the cowboy who had come to her aid. His face was weathered by sun and wind, with a strong jaw partially covered by a short beard. His eyes were sharp and observant, taking in details without judgment. "Why did you help me?" she asked suddenly. Mason poked at the fire with a stick. "Heard a shot, heard a scream. Some things a man can't ignore." He looked up at her. "Do you want to tell me what happened?" Nora stared into the flames. "My brothers want me to marry Calvin Rutledge. He's a rancher with more money than sense and more land than heart. He's offered to buy our struggling ranch for a good price if I come with the deal." Her voice grew bitter. "Like I'm just another head of cattle to be traded, and tonight they decided they were done asking." She pulled the blanket tighter. "They held me down. Said they'd break my spirit if necessary, but I was going to agree to the marriage one way or another." Her voice cracked. "I got away, grabbed my father's pistol, and ran." Mason's expression darkened, but his voice remained steady. "How many brothers?" "3. Daniel, Edward, and Joseph. They took over after our parents died of fever 5 years ago. And they're likely still searching for you." Nora nodded. "They won't give up easily. Too much money at stake." She looked at him directly. "I can't go back. I won't." "Then you won't," Mason said simply. "Get some rest." "I'll keep watch." Despite her intention to stay awake, exhaustion soon claimed Nora. The last thing she remembered was Mason sitting across the fire, his rifle across his knees, his eyes alert as he scanned the darkness beyond their small haven. Morning came with harsh clarity. Nora woke with a start, momentarily disoriented until the events of the previous night flooded back. Mason was already up, tending to his horse and preparing a simple breakfast of coffee and hardtack. "Your feet need tending," he said, nodding toward her injured ankles and soles. "I have some salve that might help." Nora examined her feet in the daylight, grimacing at the cuts and swelling. "Thank you," she said quietly, accepting the small tin he offered. As she applied the salve, Mason outlined their options. "Medicine Bow is too dangerous, your brothers will be watching. We could head to Laramie or Cheyenne, find you safe passage on a train east." "East to what?" Nora asked. "I have no family, no money, no prospects." Mason considered this. "I know some people in Colorado, good people who might help until you decide what you want." Nora studied him, still wary but grateful. "Why are you doing this? You don't know me. Let's just say I've seen what happens when good people look the other way." He met her gaze steadily. "No one deserves what your brothers tried to do. Besides, I was heading south anyway." After breaking camp, they set out, staying off the main trails. Mason was a skilled tracker and knew how to move without leaving obvious signs. Nora rode behind him now, holding onto his waist as Chance navigated the rough terrain. Around midday, they stopped in a grove of cottonwoods to rest the horse. As Mason refilled their canteens from a small stream, Nora spotted movement on a distant ridge. "Mason," she whispered urgently, pointing. 3 riders were silhouetted against the sky, scanning the landscape below. Even at this distance, Nora recognized her brother's postures. "They must have picked up our trail," Mason said, his voice calm despite the danger. "We need to move, but carefully." They mounted quickly, with Mason guiding Chance into a dense thicket that offered cover while they considered their options. The nearest settlement was a small mining town called Silver Creek, about 15 miles southeast, but reaching it meant crossing open country where they'd be visible for miles. "We could wait until nightfall," Nora suggested. Mason shook his head. "They know these lands better than I do. Our best chance is to find somewhere to make a stand if necessary." He studied the terrain. "There's an old trapper's cabin about 5 miles from here. Not much, but it has walls and a door." They set off at a trot, keeping to lower ground where possible. Nora's anxiety grew with each passing minute, her hands gripping Mason's shirt tightly. She had never imagined defying her brothers like this, never thought she would be hunted by her own family. The cabin appeared, as Mason had described, little more than a one-room shelter with a sagging roof and a door that hung crookedly on leather hinges. But it had thick log walls and a defensible position with a clear view of the approaches. "It's not much," Mason said as they dismounted, "but it'll do." Inside, the cabin was dusty but intact. A rough-hewn table, a bed frame with a rotted mattress, and a stone fireplace were the only furnishings. Mason immediately set about assessing their situation, checking his rifle and the few extra rounds he carried. "How good are you with that pistol?" he asked, nodding toward the gun still clutched in Nora's hand. "My father taught me to shoot," she replied, "but I've never shot at a person." Mason's expression was grim. "Let's hope you don't have to start now." He moved to the single window, scanning the horizon. "Your brothers, will they back down if confronted?" Nora considered the question. "Daniel might. He's the youngest and has always been more easily swayed. Edward follows Joseph's lead, and Joseph." She shook her head. "Joseph won't stop. He sees the ranch as his birthright, and he needs Rutledge's money to keep it." The sound of approaching horses interrupted their conversation. Mason motioned for Nora to stay back as he positioned himself beside the window, rifle ready but not visible from outside. 3 riders approached slowly, spreading out as they neared the cabin. "Joseph," the eldest at 30, led the way. His face was set in hard lines, his rifle resting casually across his saddle. "Nora," he called. "Come on out, sister. This foolishness has gone on long enough." Mason glanced at Nora, who had pressed herself against the wall, her face pale but determined. "Stay here," he whispered, then stepped outside, rifle held low but ready. Joseph reined in his horse, eyes narrowing at the unexpected figure. His brothers flanked him, Edward looking uncomfortable while Daniel's expression showed concern. "This doesn't concern you, stranger," Joseph said coldly. "We're looking for our sister, family business." Mason's stance remained relaxed, but his eyes were sharp. "The lady made it pretty clear she doesn't want to go with you. I respect a woman's choice." Joseph's laugh was harsh. "Lady, you're defending a hysterical girl who doesn't know what's good for her or our family." His hand tightened on his rifle. "Step aside." "Can't do that," Mason replied evenly. "Miss O'Connell asked for my help and she's got it." Edward shifted in his saddle. "Joseph, maybe we should—" "Shut up," Joseph snapped. "She's coming home one way or another." His gaze returned to Mason. "I don't know who you are, mister, but you're interfering in O'Connell business. That's not healthy." The tension stretched between them, a bowstring pulled too tight. Mason knew he was outnumbered, but he also recognized the hesitation in the younger brother's postures. They weren't killers, not yet anyway. "Your sister told me what you tried to do last night," Mason said, his voice carrying to all three men. "Holding her down, trying to force her into marriage. Where I come from, men who treat women that way answer for it." Joseph's face darkened with rage. "You have no idea what you're talking about. Our ranch is dying. The marriage would save all of us." "Not all of us," Nora's voice rang out as she stepped through the doorway, her father's pistol steady in her hands. "Just you and your pride, Joseph." The sight of his sister, bruised but defiant, caused Joseph to flinch slightly. "You ungrateful, I loved that ranch too," Nora interrupted. "I would have worked alongside you to save it, but you never saw me as an equal, just property to be traded." Daniel, the youngest brother at 24, looked ashamed. "Nora, I'm sorry about last night. Things got out of hand." "Out of hand?" Nora's voice rose. "You held me down while Joseph slapped me. You watched while he threatened worse. How is that out of hand?" The accusation hung in the air, damning in its simplicity. Edward looked away, unable to meet his sister's gaze, while Daniel's face flushed with shame. Mason kept his focus on Joseph, recognizing him as the real threat. The eldest O'Connell brother was seething, his knuckles white on his rifle. "You've turned my own brothers against me," Joseph growled. "Always manipulating, always playing the victim." "No one's manipulating anyone," Mason said calmly. "She's told her side and I believe her. Now you have a choice: ride away and leave her be, or push this and see how it ends." For a moment, it seemed Joseph might choose violence. His finger twitched near the trigger of his rifle, his face contorted with rage. But then Edward placed a restraining hand on his arm. "Joseph, enough," Edward said quietly. "Look at her. Look at what we did." The words seemed to penetrate Joseph's anger. For the first time, he truly looked at his sister, the bruises on her face, the torn dress, the fear and determination in her eyes. Something shifted in his expression, not quite remorse, but perhaps recognition. "The ranch will fail without Rutledge's money," he said finally. "Then let it fail," Nora replied. "I won't sacrifice my life to save it." A tense silence followed, broken only by the sound of wind through the prairie grass. Finally, Joseph lowered his rifle. "You're making a mistake," he said, but the fight had gone out of his voice. "Maybe," Nora acknowledged, "but it's my mistake to make." Joseph spat on the ground, then turned his horse. "Come on," he said to his brothers. "She's made her choice." Edward hesitated. "Nora, I'm sorry, truly." Daniel looked like he wanted to say more, but Joseph's sharp command had him turning his horse reluctantly. The three brothers rode away, Joseph not looking back, the others casting lingering glances over their shoulders. Only when they were small figures on the horizon did Mason lower his rifle. Beside him, Nora's hands finally began to shake, the pistol drooping toward the ground. "They're really gone," she whispered, disbelief and relief mingling in her voice. Mason gently took the pistol from her trembling fingers. "For now," he said honestly. "Joseph may return once his pride heals. But I think your other brothers might be having second thoughts." Nora nodded, exhaustion suddenly washing over her. The confrontation had drained what little strength she had left after the previous night's ordeal. "What happens now?" she asked, looking up at Mason. He considered the question carefully. "That depends on you, Miss O'Connell. We could still head to Colorado as planned, or—" He hesitated. "Or," she prompted. "Or I know of a small ranch for sale near Silver Creek. The owner's getting on in years, wants to move east to live with his daughter. It's nothing fancy, but the land is good. I've been considering it myself." Nora looked at him with surprise. "You'd stay in Wyoming," Mason shrugged, a hint of color touching his cheeks. "Been drifting a long time. Maybe it's time to put down some roots." His eyes met hers. "And maybe you'd consider staying too. Not with me," he added quickly. "But nearby, Silver Creek could use a woman of your courage." The offer was unexpected, and Nora found herself considering it seriously. She had never imagined a life beyond the O'Connell ranch, had never been given the freedom to choose her own path. "I have no money," she reminded him. "The ranch needs work," Mason replied. "I could use a partner who knows cattle and isn't afraid of hard labor. You'd earn your share." A business arrangement, not charity. Nora appreciated the distinction. Still, she hesitated. "Why would you do this for a stranger?" Mason's expression softened slightly. "Maybe I'm tired of being a stranger myself." He looked out at the vast Wyoming landscape. "Besides, I've learned to trust my instincts. They're telling me you're someone worth knowing better, Miss O'Connell." The simple honesty of his words touched something in Nora. For the first time since her parents' death, someone was seeing her, truly seeing her as a person of value. "I think," she said slowly, "that after everything we've been through, you might call me Nora." A smile touched Mason's eyes. "Nora it is, then." They spent that night in the trapper's cabin, with Mason insisting on sleeping outside to keep watch despite Nora's protests. By morning, there was still no sign of the O'Connell brothers, but neither of them expected an immediate return. Joseph's pride had been wounded, and that kind of injury festered before it struck. The journey to Silver Creek took most of the day, with chance carrying both of them at a steady pace. The small mining town appeared in the late afternoon, a collection of wooden buildings nestled in a valley with the mountains rising behind it. "It's not much," Mason admitted as they approached. "About 300 souls, mostly miners and the people who supply them." To Nora, who had rarely left the O'Connell ranch, the town seemed bustling and full of possibility. As they rode down the main street, curious glances followed them, a strange cowboy and a woman in a torn dress, sharing a horse. Mason guided them to the town's only hotel, a 2-story wooden structure with peeling paint but clean windows. "Wait here," he said, helping Nora dismount. "I'll secure us rooms." Nora stood beside Chance, conscious of her disheveled appearance as townspeople passed by. A woman across the street was watching her with particular interest, a tall, dignified woman in her 50s with silver-streaked black hair. When Mason returned, he nodded toward the woman. "That's Mrs. Porter, the town's seamstress and unofficial guardian of propriety. Looks like you've caught her attention." Before Nora could respond, the woman crossed the street with purposeful strides. Up close, Her face was kind despite her stern bearing. "Young lady," Mrs. Porter said, addressing Nora directly, "it appears you've had some trouble." Nora straightened, unwilling to be pitied. "I've had a difficult journey, madam, but I'm all right." Mrs. Porter's eyes took in the bruises, the torn dress, and the determined set of Nora's jaw. Something like approval flickered in her expression. "I'm sure you are," she said. "Nevertheless, I think we might find you something more suitable to wear. My shop is just down the street, and I have several ready-made dresses that might serve until we can create something proper." The offer was made without condescension, one practical woman to another. Nora glanced at Mason, who nodded encouragingly. "That's very kind," Nora said. "I would appreciate it, Mrs. Porter." "Martha, please." The seamstress turned to Mason. "Mr. O'Brien, I presume you'll be calling on Mr. Holloway about the Anderson place." Mason looked surprised. "News travels fast." Martha Porter smiled slightly. "In a town this size, Mr. O'Brien, news doesn't travel, it arrives before you do. I'll look after your companion while you conduct your business." And so Nora found herself in Martha Porter's shop, being fitted for a simple but well-made blue dress, while the older woman tactfully avoided asking direct questions about her circumstances. "Silver Creek is a small community," Martha said as she pinned the dress's hem, "but we look after our own. Whatever brought you here, you'll find most folks mind their manners and their own business." "I appreciate that," Nora replied. "I'm hoping to make a fresh start." Martha nodded approvingly. "As good a place as any for that. We need more women of substance here. Too many men with too little civilization between them." By the time Mason arrived at the shop, Nora was transformed. The new dress fit her well, and Martha had helped her wash and arrange her hair. The bruises on her face couldn't be hidden, but they didn't define her anymore. Mason paused in the doorway, hat in hand, clearly struck by the change. "Miss O'Connell," he said, remembering formality in Martha's presence, "you look restored." Nora felt herself blushing under his gaze. "Mrs. Porter has been very kind." "Kindness had little to do with it," Martha interjected. "The girl has natural grace. The dress merely acknowledges it." She turned to Mason. "I take it you've secured lodging?" "Yes, madam. 2 rooms at the hotel, and Mr. Holloway has agreed to show us the Anderson Ranch tomorrow." Martha nodded approvingly. "Good. Now I suggest you both get some proper rest. You look like you've ridden through hell to get here." Her direct gaze softened slightly. "Welcome to Silver Creek, Miss O'Connell. I think you'll find it suits you." After thanking Martha and settling the bill, which Mason insisted on paying despite Nora's protests, they walked to the hotel. The town was quieting as the sun set, with miners returning from their claims and shopkeepers closing up for the day. "Mr. Holloway seems a fair man," Mason said as they walked. "He's asking a reasonable price for the Anderson place, 300 acres, a small house, barn, and about 40 head of cattle. Nothing fancy, but good water and decent grazing." "And you're really considering it?" Nora asked. "Settling down here," Mason nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Been moving too long. A man gets tired of having no place to call his own." He glanced at her. "What about you? Still thinking about Colorado?" Nora considered the question seriously. "I hardly know this place, but—" She looked around at the town, the mountains rising beyond it. "There's something about it that feels possible." She met his gaze. "I'd like to see this ranch tomorrow, if that's all right." The smile that crossed Mason's face made something flutter in Nora's chest. "I was hoping you'd say that." They reached the hotel, where the proprietor, a balding man named Mr. Jenkins, showed them to their rooms, simple but clean, with real beds that looked like heaven after the previous night in the trapper's cabin. "Supper's served until 8, Mr. Jenkins informed them. "Nothing fancy, but Mrs. Jenkins is a fair hand with a stew." After he left, Mason turned to Nora. "I'll be next door if you need anything. Try to rest tomorrow will be a full day." Nora nodded, suddenly aware of how exhausted she truly was. "Mason," she said as he turned to leave. "Thank you for everything." He tipped his hat, a gesture that somehow conveyed both respect and warmth. "Sleep well, Nora." Alone in her room, Nora sat on the edge of the bed, overwhelmed by how much her life had changed in less than 2 days. She had left everything she knew, defied her brothers, and traveled with a stranger to a town where no one knew her name. It should have terrified her, this complete upheaval, but instead she felt a growing sense of possibility. For the first time in her life, the future was unwritten, and she held the pen. The next morning dawned clear and bright. After a simple breakfast in the hotel dining room, Mason and Nora met Mr. Holloway, the town's banker and attorney, who would take them to see the Anderson ranch. Old Bill Anderson was one of the first settlers in these parts, Holloway explained as they rode in his wagon. Built that place with his own hands back in '59. Raised 3 boys there, all gone to California now. His wife passed 2 winters ago, and he's been struggling to keep things going since. The road wound through rolling hills covered with spring grass, occasionally passing small homesteads or mining claims. After about an hour, they crested a rise, and the Anderson ranch came into view below. It was modest, but well situated, a small valley with a clear creek running through it, protected on 3 sides by gentle slopes. The house was a simple 2-story structure of weathered logs with a stone chimney. A barn and several outbuildings stood nearby, and in the distance, cattle grazed on the hillsides. "Not fancy," Holloway said, "but solid. Good water year-round, decent soil in parts, and the grazing's reliable. Bill's asking $1,800, including the stock and equipment." Mason whistled softly. "That's more than fair." "He's more concerned with finding the right buyer than getting top dollar," Holloway replied. "Wants someone who'll respect what he built, not just use the land and move on." As they approached the house, an elderly man emerged onto the porch, tall and straight despite his years, with a full white beard and weathered hands that spoke of decades of hard work. "Bill," Holloway called in greeting. "Brought those folks I mentioned." Bill Anderson's keen eyes assessed Mason and Nora as they stepped down from the wagon. "Mr. O'Brien," he said, nodding to Mason before turning to Nora with a hint of surprise. "And Miss O'Connell," Nora supplied. "Nora O'Connell." "Miss O'Connell is considering a partnership in the venture," Mason explained, his tone matter of fact. Bill's eyebrows rose slightly, but he nodded without comment. "Well then, let me show you what I've built." The tour was thorough, the house with its 4 rooms downstairs and 2 upstairs, the barn with stalls for 8 horses, the tool shed, smokehouse, and chicken coop. Throughout, Bill spoke with quiet pride of the ranch he had created from wilderness. "Land's good to those who respect it," he said as they walked along the creek. "Never tried to take more than it could give, and it's rewarded me for it." Nora found herself increasingly drawn to the place. It wasn't grand like some of the sprawling ranches owned by cattle barons, but it had a sense of harmony and purpose that appealed to her. "The garden's gone fallow this year," Bill admitted, showing them a plot behind the house. "Margaret, my wife, she always tended that. Haven't had the heart to plant it." "It's good soil," Nora observed, kneeling to run her fingers through the earth. "It would yield well with care." Bill looked at her with new interest. "You know gardens, Miss O'Connell?" "My mother taught me," she replied. "We grew most of what we ate on our ranch." "And she knows cattle," Mason added. "Grew up on a ranch over by Medicine Bow." Bill nodded, something decided in his expression. "Well then, let me show you the north pasture, best grazing on the property." As they walked, Holloway fell into step beside Mason. "Unusual arrangement you're proposing," he commented quietly. "People will talk." Mason's expression remained neutral. "People always do, doesn't make it their business." The banker studied him for a moment, then shrugged. "True enough. For what it's worth, I think Bill likes the idea. He's turned down 3 buyers already didn't trust them to honor the place." By the time they returned to the house, the sun was high overhead. Bill invited them to share a simple lunch of bread, cheese, and coffee on the porch while they discussed terms. "1800's my price," Bill stated. "Not looking to bargain. Half now, half in a year if you need it that way." Mason nodded. "I can manage 1,000 now, the rest by next spring after the first cattle sale." He glanced at Nora. Miss O'Connell's contribution would be her expertise and labor until she's established her own funds. Bill considered this, his gaze moving between them. "Unconventional," he said finally. "But this is Wyoming, not Boston. I've known men who started with less and succeeded." He extended his hand to Mason. "You've got yourself a ranch, Mr. O'Brien, provided the lady agrees." All eyes turned to Nora. The decision shouldn't have been easy, committing to a place she'd just seen, entering a business arrangement with a man she barely knew. Yet something about it felt right, as if she were finally stepping onto a path that had been waiting for her all along. "I agree," she said firmly, meeting Bill's gaze. "And I promise you, Mr. Anderson, we'll honor what you've built here." The old rancher's face creased in a smile. "Never doubted it, miss. I've always believed you can judge a person's character by how they look at the land." "You both look at it right." They shook hands all around, and Holloway promised to have the papers ready the following day. As they prepared to leave, Bill took Mason aside for a moment, speaking words that Nora couldn't hear, but that brought a serious nod from the younger man. The ride back to town was filled with practical discussion supplies they would need, arrangements for Mason to withdraw his savings from a bank in Cheyenne, plans for the coming months. Beneath the pragmatic conversation ran a current of excitement and possibility that neither of them acknowledged directly. When they reached Silver Creek, Holloway dropped them at the hotel with a promise to have everything ready by noon the next day. As he drove away, Mason and Nora stood together in the late afternoon sunlight, the reality of their decision settling around them. "It's happening very fast," Nora said quietly. Mason nodded. "Too fast. Having second thoughts?" "No," she replied, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "It feels right, but it is a significant change from 2 days ago when I was." She trailed off, memories of that night threatening to overshadow the present. "When you were prisoner to your brother's plans," Mason finished gently. "You're not anymore, Nora. Whatever happens with the ranch, you're free to choose your own path." The simple truth of his words touched her deeply. "Thank you for reminding me of that." They stood in companionable silence for a moment, watching the town's evening routines unfold around them. "What did Bill say to you?" Nora asked finally. "Before we left." A smile touched Mason's lips. "He said I'd better have separate sleeping arrangements ready if I wanted to avoid a visit from the town council. Apparently, Mrs. Porter is its president." Nora felt heat rise in her cheeks. "Oh, don't worry," Mason assured her. "The house has 4 rooms downstairs and 2 up. Plenty of space for propriety." The practical solution eased the momentary awkwardness, and they went inside to prepare for dinner. As Nora changed into the second dress Martha had provided, she found herself thinking about the future not with anxiety but with growing anticipation. The next day passed in a flurry of activity. The sale was formalized in Holloway's office, with Mason counting out gold coins and signing papers that made the Anderson ranch officially his. Nora's role as a business partner was unconventional enough that Holloway had to draft special documents, but by noon, everything was legal and binding. They spent the afternoon purchasing supplies, food, tools, seeds for Nora's planned garden, and household necessities. The shopkeepers of Silver Creek were curious, but welcoming, especially after Martha Porter made a point of introducing Nora around town as a very capable young woman from Medicine Bow who'll be partnering with Mr. O'Brien at the old Anderson place. By evening, they were ready to depart. Bill Anderson had agreed to stay on for a week to help with the transition, and they were eager to begin establishing themselves at the ranch. As they loaded the last of their supplies into a wagon borrowed from the livery, Holloway approached with a telegram in hand. "This just came for you, Miss O'Connell," he said, holding out the yellow paper. "From Medicine Bow." Nora took it with trembling fingers, fear instantly rising within her. Had Joseph found her? Was this a threat? Mason moved closer, a silent offer of support as she unfolded the telegram. "Nora, stop Joseph gone to Cheyenne, stop Edward, and I want to make amends, stop please advise where to write, stop Daniel." Relief washed over her, followed by confusion. "Daniel wants to make amends," she said, showing Mason the telegram. "That's promising," he replied cautiously. The younger brothers seemed less committed to Joseph's plans. Nora considered her response carefully. "I'm not ready to see them yet, but perhaps." She looked up at Holloway. "Could I send a reply?" The banker nodded. "Of course. Office is still open." Her reply was brief but significant. "Daniel stop safe and well, stop not ready to meet but will accept letters through Silver Creek Post Office, stop." Nora, as Holloway took the message to send. Mason studied her face. "Are you all right?" Nora nodded slowly. "I think so." Daniel was always the kindest of them, and if Joseph is in Cheyenne. She straightened her shoulders. "It's a start." The journey to the ranch was quiet, both of them lost in their own thoughts as the wagon rumbled through the gathering dusk. Bill Anderson was waiting on the porch as they approached, a lantern glowing warmly beside him. "Welcome home," he called, the simple greeting carrying unexpected weight. Home. The word resonated in Nora's heart as she looked at the weathered house silhouetted against the darkening sky. She had left one home in desperation and fear. Perhaps she had found another in courage and hope. The first week at the ranch established patterns that would shape the months to come. Bill Anderson was a patient teacher, showing Mason the intricacies of the property while Nora focused on making the house functional and planning the garden. They worked from dawn until dusk, collapsing into exhausted sleep each night in their separate rooms. By the time Bill departed for California, leaving with a handshake for Mason and a surprisingly emotional embrace for Nora, they had settled into a routine that respected both the demands of the ranch and the boundaries between them. Spring yielded to early summer, and the ranch began to respond to their efforts. The cattle thrived under their care, the garden Nora planted began producing vegetables, and the house slowly transformed from Bill's sparse bachelor quarters to a more comfortable home. They established a division of labor that played to their strengths. Mason handled most of the heavy ranch work and dealing with cattle buyers, while Nora managed the household, garden, and record keeping. But they were flexible, helping each other as needed. Mason didn't hesitate to assist with canning vegetables when the garden's bounty overwhelmed Nora, and she could ride alongside him to check fences or move cattle when an extra hand was needed. Their partnership was practical and respectful, but as weeks passed, something more began to grow between them. It emerged in small moments, Mason lingering at the breakfast table to hear Nora's plans for the day, Nora waiting up to share coffee when he returned late from town, both of them sitting on the porch in the evenings, talking about everything and nothing as the stars emerged above. In Silver Creek, they were accepted as an unusual but respectable arrangement. Martha Porter had effectively decreed it so, and the town followed her lead. Mason attended to business in town alone at first, but gradually, Nora began accompanying him, building her own relationships with the shopkeepers and townspeople. Letters arrived regularly from Daniel, tentative at first, then increasingly open. Edward wrote occasionally as well, his notes more formal but sincere in their regret. Of Joseph, there was little news beyond rumors that he was working as a foreman on a large ranch near Cheyenne. By midsummer, the ranch was showing real progress. Their first cattle sale had gone well, providing funds to invest in improvements to the house and barn. Mason surprised Nora by using some of the money to purchase a piano from a family leaving for Oregon, remembering her mention of playing as a girl. "It needs tuning," he apologized as it was delivered, but the seller said it's sound. The thoughtfulness of the gesture moved Nora deeply. That evening, after the deliveryman had gone, she sat at the instrument, fingers hesitantly finding the keys. The notes were indeed out of tune, but as she played a simple melody her mother had taught her, the music filled the house with a warmth it had previously lacked. Mason stood in the doorway, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. When she finished, he smiled. "The house needed music," he said simply. That night, Nora lay awake longer than usual, thinking about the man who had rescued her on impulse, and now shaped her days with his presence. Mason O'Brien was still something of a mystery. She knew he had grown up in Texas, had fought briefly in the war despite being young, had drifted for years after his family's deaths. But the details of his past remained largely unspoken, just as he never pressed her for more about her life with her brothers. What she did know was his character, his steady reliability, his quiet competence, his unexpected moments of tenderness. She knew the sound of his laugh, rare but genuine. She knew he preferred coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in, couldn't abide liars, and would stop whatever he was doing to watch a sunset. And she knew, with growing certainty, that her feelings for him had evolved far beyond gratitude or business partnership. The realization didn't shock her. Perhaps it had been inevitable from the moment he'd heard her scream and chosen to investigate rather than ride away. But acknowledging it to herself raised new questions and uncertainties. Did he feel the same? Would acting on her feelings jeopardize the life they were building together? And was she truly ready for such emotions after her narrow escape from forced marriage? Sleep eventually claimed her without answers, but the questions lingered in the days that followed, coloring her awareness of Mason in new ways: the strength in his hands as he worked, the way sunlight caught in his hair, the quiet consideration in his voice when he asked her opinion. As July turned to August, the ranch's routine was interrupted by an unexpected visitor. Nora was hanging laundry when she spotted a rider approaching a young man on a bay horse she recognized immediately. "Daniel," she breathed, her heart racing as her youngest brother drew near. He reined in his horse at a respectful distance, removing his hat. At 24, Daniel had always been the brother who resembled her most, with the same auburn hair and green eyes they'd inherited from their mother. "Nora," he said, his voice uncertain, "I hope it's all right that I've come. Your last letter mentioned you might be ready for a visit." She studied him, noting how he seemed both familiar and strange after 4 months of separation. "It's all right," she said finally. "Mason should be back from the north pasture soon. You can wait on the porch if you'd like." Daniel dismounted, tethering his horse to the hitching post. As they walked to the porch, an awkward silence hung between them until Daniel spoke. "This is a nice place," he offered, Reminds me a bit of how our ranch was when Pa was alive. The comparison was surprisingly accurate. The O'Connell ranch had once had the same feeling of care and purpose before Joseph's bitterness had infected it. "Thank you," Nora replied, gesturing for him to take a seat in one of the chairs Bill Anderson had crafted years ago. "It's coming along well." Daniel settled into the chair, hat in his hands. "Nora, I need to say it in person. I'm sorry. What I did was unforgivable." The directness of his apology caught her off guard. In his letters, Daniel had expressed regret, but never so plainly. "Why did you go along with it?" She asked, the question that had haunted her for months. Daniel stared at his hands. "Fear, mostly. Joseph was so convinced it was the only way to save the ranch, and he's always been difficult to oppose." He looked up, meeting her gaze. "But that's no excuse. I should have stood up for you, and I didn't." The honesty in his voice touched something in Nora. Daniel had always been the brother she felt closest to, despite his participation in Joseph's schemes. "What's happening at the ranch now?" she asked. "It's struggling," Daniel admitted. "Joseph's barely speaking to us since he returned from Cheyenne. Edward's trying to manage things, but without Joseph's experience He hesitated. "Or my work," Nora finished. She had always handled much of the household and record-keeping, just as she did now at the Anderson ranch. Daniel nodded. "We didn't appreciate everything you did until you were gone." He glanced around at the well-kept yard, the flourishing garden. "You seem to be doing well here." "I am," Nora confirmed, a note of pride in her voice. "Better than I ever expected." The sound of hoofbeats announced Mason's return. He appeared around the side of the house, leading his horse, and froze momentarily at the sight of Daniel on the porch. His hand moved instinctively toward the rifle in his saddle scabbard. "It's all right," Nora called. "Daniel's come to visit. Alone." Mason's posture relaxed slightly, but his expression remained guarded as he approached. Daniel stood, clearly nervous but determined. "Mr. O'Brien," he said, extending his hand. "I owe you thanks for helping my sister when I failed her." Mason studied the younger man before accepting the handshake. "Your sister helped herself," he replied. "I just provided transportation." The modest assessment brought a small smile to Nora's face, knowing how much more Mason had done. "Daniel will be staying for dinner," she announced, making the decision in that moment. "I'll need to add more potatoes to the stew." As she went inside to adjust the meal preparations, she heard Mason invite Daniel to help him stable his horse, a tentative olive branch that her brother gratefully accepted. Through the window, she watched them walk toward the barn, Mason's tall figure beside Daniel's slighter one, and felt a knot of tension she hadn't realized she was carrying begin to loosen. Dinner was initially awkward, with Mason quiet and watchful, but as the meal progressed, conversation began to flow more naturally. Daniel spoke of changes in Medicine Bow, news of neighbors, and tentative plans he and Edward had discussed for diversifying the ranch's operations. "Edward thinks we should try raising sheep on the western section," he explained. "The grass there isn't great for cattle, but sheep might do well." "That's not a bad idea," Mason commented. "Mixed operations can weather market fluctuations better." The simple business observation seemed to break some invisible barrier, and soon the three were engaged in genuine conversation about ranching strategies, weather patterns, and the challenges of agricultural life in Wyoming. As Nora served coffee after the meal, Daniel hesitantly raised a topic she had been dreading. "Joseph asks about you," he said. In his way, Nora tensed. "What does that mean?" "He won't say your name," Daniel admitted, "but he'll ask if we've heard anything, I think." "I think he regrets how things happened, even if he's too proud to say it." Mason's expression darkened. "Regret doesn't erase what he tried to do." "No," Daniel agreed quickly. It doesn't, I'm not defending him, but I thought Nora should know he's not hunting her or anything like that. The blunt assessment brought a flood of relief Nora hadn't expected. Part of her had been waiting these past months for Joseph to appear on the horizon, gun in hand, demanding her return. "Thank you for telling me," she said quietly. "It helps to know." Daniel stayed only one night, departing after breakfast the next morning with promises to write more regularly. As Nora watched him ride away, she felt a complex mixture of emotions: relief at the tentative reconciliation, lingering wariness from months of caution, and a new sense of strength in her position. Mason stood beside her until Daniel was out of sight. "You all right?" he asked simply. Nora nodded. "Better than I expected to be. He's changed, or maybe he's finding his way back to who he was before Joseph's influence grew so strong." "People can change," Mason agreed, "for better or worse." He looked down at her, his expression softening. "Your brother said something interesting while we were in the barn yesterday." "Oh," Nora turned to him, curious. "He said he'd never seen you as happy as you seem here, not even before your parents died." The observation startled her, partly because Daniel was right. Despite the hard work and occasional struggles, she had found a contentment at the Anderson ranch that had eluded her even in better days at her family home. "I am happy here," she acknowledged, meeting Mason's gaze directly. "Happier than I thought possible after that night." Something shifted in Mason's expression, a deepening of the warmth that had been growing between them for months. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then seemed to reconsider. "We should check the south fence line today," he said instead. "Bill mentioned it needed reinforcing before winter." The moment passed, but its significance lingered as they returned to their daily tasks. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant orange and pink, Nora found herself studying Mason's profile, wondering what he might have said if he hadn't chosen practicality instead. The rhythms of ranch life continued as summer waned. They repaired fences, tended cattle, preserved the garden's bounty for winter, and made improvements to the house and barn. Each day brought them closer to winter, when they would be more isolated, relying primarily on each other's company during the short days and long nights. In late September, they made a trip to Silver Creek for supplies and to attend the town's harvest festival. The community had embraced them fully by then, with Martha Porter treating Nora almost like a daughter and the shopkeepers greeting them by name. The festival transformed the town's main street into a celebration of rural plenty, with tables laden with food, music from a small band, and dancing in the open area near the church. Nora, wearing a new dress she and Martha had made specifically for the occasion, found herself enjoying the simple pleasure of community after months of relative isolation at the ranch. As the evening progressed, Mason surprised her by asking her to dance. In all their time together, they had maintained a careful physical distance, their contact limited to occasional necessary touches while working. Now he stood before her, hand extended, a question in his eyes. "I'm not much of a dancer," he admitted, "but it seems a shame to waste the music." Nora placed her hand in his, acutely aware of the warmth of his palm against hers. "I'm not either," she confessed. "My brothers never saw much point in such things." They moved awkwardly at first, finding their rhythm as the fiddle and guitar played a simple waltz. Gradually, their steps became more synchronized, the initial stiffness melting into a comfortable flow. Mason's hand rested lightly at her waist, respectful but present, while hers found its place on his shoulder. Around them, other couples twirled and stepped, some with practiced grace, others with enthusiastic clumsiness. No one paid them particular attention, they were simply two more participants in the community celebration. Yet for Nora, The dance marked a significant shift. Within the structured movements, guided by music and tradition, she found a new way of connecting with the man who had become central to her life. Each turn brought his face into focus, the lines at the corners of his eyes, the slight curl of his hair at his collar, the careful concentration in his expression as he worked to remember the steps. When the music ended, they stepped apart, but something had changed between them. It lingered as they joined friends at a long table for pie and coffee, as they listened to the mayor's annual harvest speech, and as they drove home under a canopy of stars. The following morning, Nora woke to the sound of rain, a gentle, steady patter on the roof that promised a day of indoor tasks. After breakfast, Mason headed to the barn to repair harnesses, while she began the weekly bread baking. As she kneaded the dough, her thoughts returned to the previous night's dance, to the feeling of Mason's hand at her waist, the surprising grace they had found together despite their claimed inexperience. Something was building between them, something neither had acknowledged but both seemed increasingly aware of. The sound of the front door opening pulled her from her thoughts. Mason appeared, rain dripping from his hat and coat. "Storm's picking up," he reported, hanging his wet gear by the door. "Might be in for a couple of days of this, according to the way my bad shoulder's aching." Nora smiled at the weather prediction. "Your shoulder is more reliable than the almanac." "Bullet fragments make good barometers," he replied with a wry smile, rubbing the shoulder that bore a scar from a long-ago conflict. He crossed to the sink to wash his hands, then leaned against the counter, watching as she shaped the dough into loaves. "Smells good in here," he commented. "Should be ready by lunchtime." She glanced up, catching his gaze on her hands as they worked the dough. "Did you finish with the harnesses?" "Most of them. Thought I'd come in for coffee before tackling the rest." But he made no move toward the coffee pot, continuing instead to watch her work. There was something different in his expression, a focus, an intensity that made her heartbeat quicken. "Nora," he said finally, his voice lower than usual, "there's something I've been meaning to say." She stilled her hands, the bread forgotten. "Yes." Mason straightened from the counter, taking a step toward her. "These past months, working alongside you, building this place together." He paused, searching for words. "It's been the best time of my life." The simple declaration hung in the air between them, profound in its honesty. "Mine too," she replied softly. He took another step closer. "When I heard you scream that night, I didn't know what I was riding into, didn't know it would change everything." Nora's throat tightened with emotion. "Mason, let me finish," he requested gently. "I'm not good with words, and I need to say this right." He drew a deep breath. "I came to Wyoming looking for land, a place to settle after years of drifting. Found that, but I found something else too, something I wasn't looking for but now can't imagine living without." His gaze held hers, direct and unwavering. "I love you, Nora, not as a business partner, not as a friend, though you're both those things. I love you as a man loves a woman he wants to build a life with." The words she had hoped for but hadn't dared expect washed over her like a cleansing rain. For a moment she couldn't speak, overwhelmed by the emotion rising within her. Mason waited, patient but vulnerable, giving her time to respond. "I love you too," she said finally, the words emerging with surprising strength. "I think I have since that first night when you offered me a choice instead of making demands. Every day since has only deepened those feelings." The space between them vanished as Mason closed the final distance, his flour-dusted hands coming to rest gently on her shoulders. "May I kiss you?" he asked, the formality of the question belied by the tenderness in his voice. In answer, Nora rose on tiptoes, bringing her lips to his in a kiss that began hesitantly but quickly deepened into something more urgent. His arms encircled her waist, drawing her closer, while her flower-covered hands found their way to his chest, feeling the strong heartbeat beneath. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Mason rested his forehead against hers. "I've been wanting to do that for months," he admitted with a smile that transformed his usually serious face. "Me too," Nora confessed, surprised at her own boldness. Outside, the rain continued to fall, creating a private world within the warm kitchen. They stood together, neither willing to step away, as if the moment might dissolve if they broke contact. "What happens now?" Nora asked eventually, practical even in this emotional moment. Mason's expression grew more serious. "That depends on what you want, Nora. I'd like to court you properly if you'll allow it, and if things continue as I hope they will." He paused. "Well, we already share a home and a business. Sharing a name and a life seems the natural next step." The proposal, for that was what it was despite its indirect phrasing, brought a flush to Nora's cheeks and a warmth to her heart. "I would like that very much," she replied. "Both the courtship and what might follow." The smile that spread across Mason's face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. He kissed her again, more confidently this time, his hands cradling her face with a tenderness that made her eyes sting with unexpected tears. When they separated, Mason glanced at the abandoned bread dough. "I think we've neglected your baking," he observed, humor lighting his eyes. Nora laughed, the sound bubbling up from a well of happiness she hadn't known existed within her. "It can wait a few minutes more," she decided, pulling him back for another kiss. The rainstorm lasted 3 days, transforming the ranch into an island of warmth and light amid the gray downpour. They used the time to make plans, both practical and personal. Their partnership would continue, but with a new dimension that enhanced rather than complicated their working relationship. Mason would speak to Reverend Thomas in Silver Creek about performing a ceremony when they were ready. When the skies finally cleared, they rode to town together to share their news. Martha Porter was unsurprised, merely commenting that she'd been wondering when they'd come to their senses. The other townspeople offered congratulations that ranged from hearty backslaps for Mason to knowing smiles for Nora. Their courtship, conducted within the confines of an already established partnership, had a unique character. Mason began the practice of bringing small gifts when returning from town: ribbons for Nora's hair, a book of poetry, once even a silver thimble he'd noticed her admiring in the general store's display. Nora found ways to show her affection through special meals, a new shirt sewn from fabric she'd been saving, and willingness to listen when he occasionally spoke of his past. As autumn deepened toward winter, they grew increasingly comfortable with physical affection, hands clasped while sitting by the fire, brief kisses in passing, the casual touch of shoulders while working side by side. Their evenings lengthened, filled with conversation, music from the now tuned piano, and a deepening understanding of each other. In late October, a letter arrived from Daniel with unexpected news. Joseph had left the O'Connell ranch, selling his share to his brothers and heading west to try his luck in Nevada's silver mines. "He left without really explaining," Daniel wrote. "Just said there was nothing for him here anymore. Edward and I are managing, though we miss your expertise. We've implemented some of the mixed farming ideas Mr. O'Brien suggested, and early results are promising." The letter continued with news of neighbors and town events before ending with a personal note. "I've met someone, Nora. Her name is Rebecca Turner, the new schoolteacher. I'm not sure where it might lead, but for the first time, I understand why you chose freedom over security. Some things are worth the risk." Nora read the letter aloud to Mason as they sat on the porch, bundled against the autumn chill to watch the sunset. "Your brother sounds changed," Mason observed when she finished reading. Nora nodded, folding the letter carefully. Joseph's departure probably helped. He always cast a long shadow. She was quiet for a moment, contemplating the news. I'm glad he's gone, yet somehow sad too. He wasn't always as he became after our parents died. Mason covered her hand with his. Grief affects people differently. Some grow harder, some softer. And some find the strength to start again, Nora added, turning her hand to intertwine her fingers with his. Like us. The first snow came in mid-November, blanketing the ranch in pristine white. They had prepared well. The barn was stocked with hay, the root cellar full of preserved vegetables, the woodpile high enough to last through the coldest months. The cattle had been moved to the protected southern pasture, with extra feed stored in the shelters Mason had constructed based on Bill Anderson's advice. Their wedding was planned for Christmas Eve, a time when travel was difficult but not impossible for those invited: Daniel and Edward, Martha Porter and several other friends from Silver Creek, and the handful of neighboring ranchers they had come to know. Reverend Thomas had agreed to perform the ceremony at the ranch rather than in town, understanding their desire to begin their married life in the home they had built together. As the date approached, Nora found herself reflecting on the extraordinary journey of the past 9 months. She had fled her family home in terror, with nothing but a pistol and the clothes on her back. Now she stood on the threshold of a new life, one she had chosen freely, with a man who saw her as an equal partner rather than a possession to be traded. The day before the wedding, she was reviewing their preparations when a knock at the door startled her. Mason was in the barn, and they weren't expecting guests until the following day. Cautiously, she approached the door, old habits of wariness resurfacing. Through the window, she saw a single rider, a man she didn't immediately recognize, his hat pulled low against the cold. When she opened the door, he looked up, and shock froze her in place. "Joseph," she breathed, her brother's name forming a cloud in the cold air between them. He stood awkwardly, hat in hand, his face thinner than she remembered and lined with new creases. At 31, he suddenly looked much older. "Nora," he replied, his voice rough. "I know I'm not welcome, but I heard about tomorrow, thought I should come." Confusion and wariness warred within her. "How did you hear?" "Daniel wrote to me in Nevada." Joseph shifted uncomfortably. "I'm not staying long, just wanted to see for myself that you're, well." The sound of approaching footsteps announced Mason's arrival. He appeared around the corner of the house, axe in hand, and stopped abruptly at the sight of Joseph. His expression hardened and he moved to Nora's side, protective without being possessive. "O'Connell," he acknowledged, his tone neutral but vigilant. Joseph nodded in response. "O'Brien." An awkward silence stretched between them until Nora found her voice again. "Why are you really here, Joseph?" Her oldest brother looked down at the hat in his hands, turning it slowly. "To apologize," he said finally, the words seeming to cost him considerable effort. What I tried to do was unforgivable. I know that now." The admission, so long in coming, left Nora momentarily speechless. Beside her, Mason remained silent, allowing her to respond as she saw fit. "It was unforgivable," she agreed, her voice steady. "You were willing to sacrifice my happiness, my very self, for money." Joseph nodded, accepting the accusation without defense. "I was wrong. The ranch was failing and I was desperate, but that's no excuse." He looked up, meeting her gaze directly. "I didn't come asking for forgiveness, Nora. Just wanted you to know I recognize what I did, and I'm sorry for it." The simple apology, devoid of justification or expectation, touched something in Nora that she had thought long buried. Not forgiveness exactly, but perhaps the beginning of understanding. "Would you like to come in?" she offered, surprising both men. It's cold out here. Joseph hesitated, glancing at Mason, who gave a slight nod after studying Nora's face. Inside, the warmth of the house enveloped them, a stark contrast to the emotional chill. Joseph stood awkwardly in the main room, taking in the comfortable furnishings, the piano, the Christmas greenery Nora had arranged. "You've made a good home here," he observed. "We have," Nora agreed, emphasis on the plural. Mason moved to build up the fire, giving them a moment while remaining present. Joseph watched him work, then turned back to his sister. "Daniel says you're partners in this place." Nora nodded. "Equal partners in everything." Joseph absorbed this, something like recognition dawning in his expression. "That's what you wanted at our ranch, what I never allowed." "Yes," she confirmed. "I wanted a voice, Joseph, a choice in my own life." Her brother's shoulders sagged slightly. "I was raised to believe men made the decisions. Pa always did." He shook his head. "But Pa never would have tried to force you to marry against your will. That was my doing, my failure." The honest assessment seemed to drain something from him, leaving him looking older and strangely diminished. For the first time, Nora saw past the domineering brother to the man beneath, flawed, struggling, but perhaps not irredeemable. "Will you stay for dinner?" she asked, the invitation surprising even her. "The others arrive tomorrow, but tonight it's just us." Joseph looked uncertain. "I don't want to intrude." "It's an invitation, not an intrusion," Mason said, speaking for the first time since they'd entered the house. His tone wasn't warm, but neither was it hostile. "Your sister's offering a meal, not absolution." The blunt clarification seemed to ease something in Joseph. He nodded, accepting the boundaries implied. "Thank you. I'd be grateful." The meal was simple beef stew, fresh bread, and apple pie for dessert. Conversation remained cautious but gradually thawed as Joseph shared news of his experiences in Nevada, and Nora spoke of their plans for the ranch. Mason contributed occasionally, his initial wariness slowly giving way to a guarded acceptance of Joseph's presence. As they finished the meal, Joseph reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a small package wrapped in brown paper. "I brought this for tomorrow," he said, placing it on the table. "A wedding gift, not much, but—" He pushed it toward Nora. "Open it now if you'd like." Nora unwrapped the paper carefully to reveal a small wooden box, intricately carved with a pattern of leaves and flowers. Inside, nestled on a bed of velvet, lay a gold locket on a delicate chain. "It was Mother's," Joseph explained quietly. "Pa gave it to her on their wedding day. I took it when she died, thinking to give it to my wife someday, but—" He shrugged. "It belongs to you." Nora lifted the locket, opening it to find a tiny daguerreotype of their parents on their wedding day, young, smiling, full of hope for the future. Emotion welled within her, unexpected and powerful. "Thank you," she whispered, closing her hand around the precious memento. "This means a great deal to me." Joseph nodded, something easing in his expression. "I should go. Got a room at the hotel in Silver Creek for the night." He rose from the table. "I won't come tomorrow, don't think that would be right. But I wanted you to have that and to see for myself that you're well." Mason stood as well. "I'll walk you out." The two men left the house together, their voices a low murmur that Nora couldn't quite make out. When Mason returned several minutes later, his expression was thoughtful. "What did you say to him?" she asked. Mason settled beside her on the sofa. "Told him you were the strongest person I know, that I was grateful every day you chose to partner with me." He took her hand, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. "And that while I understood his regret, if he ever threatened your happiness again, he'd answer to me." The protective declaration warmed her heart without making her feel diminished. "And what did he say?" "That he expected nothing less." Mason's expression softened. "He's a broken man, Nora." Not excusing what he did, but I recognize someone who's paying for their mistakes, saw it in his eyes. Nora nodded, turning the locket over in her free hand. I don't forgive him, not fully, but I think I understand him better now. She looked up at Mason. Thank you for allowing that conversation to happen. It's your family, your choice, he replied simply. I'll support whatever relationship you decide to have with your brothers. The understanding in his words reaffirmed what she already knew, that the man beside her saw her as an autonomous being whose decisions he respected, even when they involved people who had hurt her. I love you, Mason O'Brien, she said, leaning against his shoulder. His arm came around her, drawing her closer. And I love you, Nora O'Connell. He pressed a kiss to her temple. For one more day, at least. Tomorrow you'll have a new name if you want it. I do want it, she assured him. But I'll always be Nora inside, the woman who ran through the night and found her own path. I wouldn't want you any other way, Mason replied, his voice warm with admiration and love. Christmas Eve dawned clear and cold, the winter sun casting long blue shadows across the pristine snow. By mid-morning, guests began arriving, Daniel and Edward first, their awkward greetings gradually warming as Nora welcomed them into the home she and Mason had created. Martha Porter appeared with several other women from town, immediately taking charge of final preparations for the celebration to follow the ceremony. The neighboring ranchers came next, bearing gifts and good wishes, followed by Reverend Thomas, who would perform the service. As the appointed hour approached, Nora stood in the bedroom she had occupied alone these past months, wearing a dress of deep blue that Martha had helped her make. At her throat hung her mother's locket, a tangible connection to her past as she stepped into her future. A knock at the door announced Daniel, who had offered to escort her into the main room where the ceremony would take place. You look beautiful, he said as she opened the door. Mother would be proud. Nora smiled, touched by the simple observation. Do you think so? I know it. He offered his arm. Ready? Taking a deep breath, she nodded, placing her hand on his sleeve. Ready. The main room had been transformed with evergreen boughs, candles, and ribbons. Chairs brought from town accommodated the 24 guests, who rose as Nora entered on Daniel's arm. At the far end of the room, beside the fireplace, where a cheerful fire burned, stood Mason and Reverend Thomas. Mason's face, as he watched her approach, held an expression of such wonder and love that Nora felt her heart might burst from happiness. He was dressed in his best clothes, his usually wind-swept hair neatly combed, but it was the light in his eyes that transformed him. Daniel placed her hand in Mason's, stepping back to join Edward in the front row. As their fingers intertwined, Nora felt a sense of rightness, of completion that transcended the ceremony about to take place. Reverend Thomas smiled at the assembled guests before beginning. Friends and family, we gather today to witness the union of Mason O'Brien and Nora O'Connell, who have found in each other a partnership of equals, a friendship of depth, and a love of enduring quality. The service was simple but meaningful, with traditional vows exchanged in voices that grew stronger with each promise made. When Mason placed the ring, a simple gold band purchased in Cheyenne, on Nora's finger, his hands were steady, his gaze unwavering. By the authority vested in me, and in the presence of these witnesses, I now pronounce you husband and wife, Reverend Thomas concluded. What God has joined together, let no one put asunder. The kiss that sealed their union was brief but tender, mindful of their audience yet unmistakably heartfelt. As they turned to face their guests, the room erupted in applause and cheers, led by Martha Porter's enthusiastic approval. The celebration that followed filled the house with laughter, music, and the warmth of community. Neighbors who had initially viewed their arrangement with skepticism now raised glasses to toast their union. Daniel and Edward, awkward but sincere, welcomed Mason as a brother. As the evening progressed, Nora found a quiet moment to step onto the porch, needing a breath of the clear winter air. The sky above was ablaze with stars, the same stars that had witnessed her desperate flight 9 months earlier. The door opened behind her and Mason joined her, draping a warm shawl around her shoulders. "Everything all right?" he asked, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. Nora nodded, leaning into his embrace. "Just taking it all in. This morning I was Nora O'Connell, a young woman who fled her brothers in the night. Now I'm Nora O'Brien with a husband, a home, and somehow a reconciled family." Mason's arms tightened around her. "You're still the same Nora who had the courage to run, to stand up to your brothers, to build a new life. The name's changed, but the heart hasn't." She turned in his arms to face him. "Thank you for hearing my scream that night, for making my brothers answer for what they'd done, for seeing me as someone worth knowing." "Best decision I ever made," he replied, bending to kiss her. "Though I think you would have found your way even without me. You're stronger than you know, Nora O'Brien." The sound of her new name on his lips sent a ripple of happiness through her. "Perhaps. But I'm glad I didn't have to." They stood together in the starlight, the sounds of celebration drifting from the house behind them, the future stretching before them like the vast Wyoming sky, boundless, challenging, and filled with possibility. 1 year later, Nora stood in the doorway of the ranch house, watching as Mason rode in from checking the cattle in the south pasture. The Anderson Ranch, now the O'Brien Ranch, had prospered under their joint care, with increased cattle herds, expanded gardens, and improvements to the house and outbuildings. As Mason dismounted, his face broke into a smile at the sight of her. Even after a year of marriage, that smile still made her heart beat faster. He crossed the yard in long strides, removing his hat as he approached. "How are my favorite people today?" he asked, placing a gentle hand on her rounded belly before kissing her. "Active," Nora replied with a laugh. "Your son or daughter seems determined to become a bronc rider before birth." Mason's expression softened as he felt the baby's movements beneath his palm. At 30, he was about to become a father, a prospect that filled him with equal parts excitement and trepidation. "3 more months," he murmured. "Hardly seems possible." Nora covered his hand with hers. "Martha says the baby will come when it's ready, regardless of what the doctor predicts." They had learned of the pregnancy in early summer, a joyful discovery that had prompted further improvements to the house, a proper nursery in what had been a storage room, a rocking chair crafted by Mason in evening hours, a cradle sent by Daniel and his new wife Rebecca, who had married in June. Relations with her brothers had continued to improve over the past year. Edward had visited twice, bringing news of the O'Connell Ranch's recovery under new methods. Daniel and Rebecca had spent a week with them in the summer, with plans to return after the baby's birth. Even Joseph had maintained a cautious correspondence, his letters gradually evolving from formal politeness to genuine interest in Nora's life and the ranch's progress. "Daniel's letter arrived today," Nora said as they walked inside together. "Rebecca is expecting as well, due in July." Mason grinned. "Cousins just a few months apart. Your mother would have been pleased." The observation was typical of him, thoughtful recognition of the family ties that remained important to Nora despite the painful past. As they settled into their evening routine, a simple meal, conversation about the day's events, plans for the following week, Nora reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this point. From a desperate flight in the darkness to a home filled with light and hope, From a business arrangement to a marriage of equals, from strangers to partners in every sense of the word. Later, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Mason's arm around her shoulders and her head resting against him, Nora felt a profound sense of peace. The ranch stretched before them, fields and pastures now blanketed in early winter snow, the barn and outbuildings solid against the coming cold, smoke rising from the chimney behind them. "You ever think about that night," she asked softly, "when you heard me scream?" Mason was quiet for a moment, his hand absently stroking her shoulder. "Sometimes," he admitted. "Usually when I wake up beside you and realize how different life would be if I'd ignored it." Nora nodded, understanding. "I think about it when I see something new, the garden in full bloom, the piano you bought me, the cradle waiting for our child. All things that wouldn't exist in my life if you hadn't been there that night." "You give me too much credit," Mason replied. "You made the first and bravest choice to run, to fight for your freedom. And you made yours to help a stranger, to stand against 3 armed men, to offer partnership instead of protection." She looked up at him, her expression serious. "We both chose, Mason, and we keep choosing every day." He nodded, acknowledging the truth in her words. "Best choices I've ever made." As darkness fell around them, stars emerging in the vast Wyoming sky, they sat in comfortable silence, the future unfolding before them like a story still being written, their story, crafted together from courage, respect, and a love born in the darkest moment of Nora's life, but destined to illuminate all the days that followed. In the quiet of the winter evening, with the promise of spring and new life waiting beyond the snow, Nora O'Brien knew with absolute certainty that she had found not just safety or security, but something far more precious, a life fully her own, shared with a man who had heard her cry for help and answered not with dominance but with partnership, not with ownership but with love. It was everything she hadn't known to want that night she fled into the darkness, and everything she would cherish for all the days to come.